and I want to get through it, and I want to get through it, and I want to do it all in 1 week, all in one session. I'm going to ask, I love having everyone's comments. I'm going to ask for people, if you have a comment or a question, to write it down, and I will allow time at the end. Just this week, I'm going to ask that. What was that? I know, I'm going to talk quickly, and I'm going to ask for no interruptions, okay? Two anomalies for me. And nafochu, exactly. And I'm hoping, and I'm going to try and leave enough time at the end for questions and comments and everything else. So just make sure to write them down. If there's something obviously you don't understand in the middle, then definitely interrupt me. Okay, so as I said to you, we've been looking at this. I'm very excited, by the way. You're my first. I'm giving this shiur in a few places for Purim. You're my guinea pigs, okay? Because all my Purim shiur are next week, so you're really my guinea pigs this week. And even more so because this is a shiur that's really. I said this to you already last time, that very often there's shiurim that some of them just come very quickly, and it takes me a couple of hours, and I prepared them. And others are very much a process, and this has very much been for me a process, a shiur that's taken me a long time. I've added things, I've taken things out, I've thought about ideas, developed ideas, put things in. I then found things once I finished the shiurim that connected, so then added them somewhere. In any case, for me, I hope you'll feel the same way, but for me it's really been a journey this year. It's really been a journey this time, and I really hope that you'll enjoy and share the journey with me, specifically also because it's related to everything that we've been doing, which is the Akedah. And I hope that once we've looked at the ideas here, we'll be able to connect them somehow to, we definitely should be able to connect them to the notion of the Akedah. And then with that, we've got, I think, a little bit left to do the Akedah, and then we'll be able to move on from there. Okay. The idea that I want to look at today is the idea of Yirat Elokim, and what Yirat Elokim means. And the question is, why is that related to Purim? Because who did not have Yirat Elokim?
Haman.
And Amalek. Specifically in the Torah, we're told Amalek that comes and attacks the people, and Ein lo Yirat Elokim. So the idea of Yirat Elokim is related to Amalek, which obviously by default is related also to Haman. And the biggest question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we battle this Ein Yirat Elokim, that there's no Yirat Elokim? Now, how is this also obviously related to the Akedah? Because as we know, we've been speaking about it, at the end of the whole Akedah story, Hashem turns around to Abraham and says to him, Ati adati ki yirat Elokim ata, now I know that you're God-fearing. And we know also that it's also to do with the story, which we're going to see shortly, that when he goes to Avimelech in Gura, he turns around to Avimelech when he says to him, why didn't you tell me she was your sister, after God comes to Avimelech in a dream? And he turns around and he says to him, because there's no Yirat Elokim but Makom Hazeh. Now, in order to, so that's how, by the way, this whole title started. Funny enough, when Sue at Matan asked me for a title already quite a few weeks ago, I was deep into teaching you and a few other places the story of the Akedah. And when she asked me for a title about Purim, I couldn't shift my focus to Purim. And all of a sudden I suddenly realized, when I was looking back at all my old Purim shiurim, that this whole idea of Yirat Elokim is mamash related, which we've been focusing on the Akedah, mamash related to Purim. So I just threw her out a title without knowing exactly what I was going to do, which is usually what happens, because she usually asks this stuff. This time she asked for it quite near the time, but usually asks for it months in advance. And this is how I've developed it since. So, first and foremost, we have a very interesting pasuk in Kohelet that says, Sof davar hakol nishma, et ha'elokim yir'eh, ve'et mitzvotav shamor, ki zeh kol ha'adam. What is the whole of man, the everything of man? What is that? What is holistic man, does Kohelet tell us? That he is Yir'eh Elokim and Shomer Mitzvot. Now, if the two went hand in hand. If when you fulfilled the commandments, it led to Yirat Elokim, you wouldn't need to say the two together. You wouldn't need to say the two separately. Meaning what Kohelet seems to be telling us here is, Kohelet, whoever wrote it, okay, Shlomo HaMelech, sorry. What Shlomo HaMelech seems to be telling us here is that there are two different concepts. There is the concept of Shomer Mitzvot, and then there is the concept of Yirat Elokim. And the question is, do the two go hand in hand? Does one lead to the other? Is one extra? Is one more than the other? Is it not enough just to fulfill the commandments in order to be a Yirat Elokim? Okay, and this is what I want to discuss. I really want us to try and understand, what does this notion mean? What does it mean to say that I am Yirei Elokim, that I am God-fearing? Now, again, the translation is problematic. Yirei Elokim generally translates as God-fearing. What does it mean to be God-fearing? What does God-fearing actually mean? And that's what I want to try and develop today. But in order to do that, I'm bringing for you a fascinating book which we've touched upon. We've looked at him already when we looked at Akedah. Someone called Howard Wetstein. I've given the book back to the library, so I don't have it anymore. Otherwise, I'd show it to you. But it's called The Significance of Religious Experience. It's a more academic book. Howard Wetstein is professor of philosophy in, if I'm not mistaken, where did I tell you? It's somewhere in Canada, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I have to double check that. A religious guy, and you get the feel, you understand that he was Jewish, Orthodox, but then he kind of is a Baal Tshuva kind of thing, but in a very specific way. And one of the chapters in his book is about the idea of awe. It's about the idea of Yirat Elokim, okay? And this really kind of propelled me to trying to undig this whole idea. After I read this chapter, it had an enormous impact on me. Funnily enough, I read this chapter when I was in Tampa with my mum. And at the time when I read it, I was very lucky in the sense that I didn't have a million kids. I didn't have my 4 kids all around me, driving me crazy, and I didn't have to make supper and lunch and everything. I had to look after my mum, but I had headspace to think about it. And it really got me thinking. I really spent about two weeks really thinking about this chapter that he wrote, because it had a huge impact on me. Because what he says in this chapter is that the sum total, or there is an let's put it this way. There is an overriding kind of characteristic of man that is called Yirat Elokim. And it's not something that comes like this. It's actually a life work. To become a Yirei Elokim doesn't just mean I fear God, I'm scared of God, doesn't even just mean I'm in awe of God. It's something far bigger and far greater. It's a character development. Now, it was very difficult for me to kind of bring you only a few bits, but I brought you only a few bits. And I want to read it with you just to begin to lay out the foundation, to set the paradigm up of what we're talking about here. And then I'm going to prove it to you from Tanakh. Howard Wetstein, source number 1. We have been exploring ordinary awe experiences for their religious content, and we have hit upon the duality, humbled but elevated a powerful religious idea. But there is more. So here he specifically is talking about awe. Okay, awe experiences perhaps as a consequence of the duality being that on the one hand they engender a sense of humility, of, if you stand in front, he gives the example of, for example, the Grand Canyon. If you stand in front of the Grand Canyon, what do you experience? Wow. Awe. Okay, you experience awe, right? Which on the one hand denigrates you, because you feel, I'm nothing. What am I in comparison to this enormous wow? Okay. On the other hand, it also, there's a duality there, because on the other hand, it gives you a sense of appreciation. Okay, so there's these two elements to it. All experiences, perhaps as a consequence of the duality, characteristically engender a generosity of spirit, a lack of pettiness, increased ability to forgive and to contain anger and disappointment. To feel and behave in these ways is to feel and behave as according to the tradition God does. And I think, again, here, this is the end of how he develops that idea. But I think what he says here is so profound. What he essentially said to us is, when we really understand what Yirat Elokim is, and it comes from a whole different thing. One of the things is awe, but there's a whole load of things which he's going to talk about. It leads us to right? A generosity of spirit, a lack of pettiness, increased ability to forgive. And all of these things are being what he calls B'Tselem Elokim. Okay, being in the image of God. So I'm going through here now two different things he talks about. One is the all fear category of Yirat Elokim, and the other is the all mystery. Okay, both of which are very important to build this characteristic of being Yirat Elokim. So firstly, the all fear. He uses, by the way, unsurprisingly, he uses a lot of Heschel, okay? A lot of Heschel. The Hebrew word that Heschel translates as awe is yirah. In biblical Hebrew, the word sometimes means awe, sometimes fear, and sometimes has the quality of both awe and fear. Despite some of the standard translations, it is far from clear why simply being frightened of God is supposed to be of great ethical value, or why such a fright is so admirable as to be considered the beginning of wisdom, which there he's quoting from Tehillim, where there's a quote, there's a pasuk that talks about the idea of Yirat Elokim being Tchilat, Reshit Chochmah. Reshit Chochmah, Yirat Elokim. Thank you. Yirat Hashem. Yafeh. Okay. As we are told that Yirah is in Tehillim, many awe experiences, insofar as they involve powerful natural or spiritual forces, involve elements of fear. So fear doesn't necessarily, fear is a component, okay? It's not the component, but it is a component of this Yirat Elokim. What about mystery? In awe and amazement, the prophets stand before the mystery of the universe, writes Heschel. Nor is it just the prophets. We often feel awe at things that seem beyond our comprehension. Childbirth, for example, or the birth of ideas or art. Mystery then is closely related to awe, where mystery is understood in terms of wonderment and the sense that we are in over our heads. Now again, mystery here is not the idea of, I don't understand. That's not what mystery is. This is not how he's defining it. He's defining it much more in Heschelian terms, in Heschel terms, which is this idea of mystery being in hand with awe. It's this sense of there's something that's beyond our comprehension, like childbirth, right? We can scientifically explain childbirth, but when you're standing in that moment in a room when a child is being born, there is a sense of awe. Funny enough, we were talking about the Greenberg, so a lot of people came up to me afterwards and they said to me that they felt in his presence, and I've always felt this from the minute I met him, and I thought it was just me, but so many people came up to me after the evening that he has a certain presence about him, like a mystery and awe presence about him, even the two of them together. And I think there are some people that have that presence, and there's also moments that have those presents, okay? There's moments where there is a mystery. We can't explain it. We feel we're in over our heads. It's not explained, but it's only explainable through the categories of not I don't understand or I don't comprehend, but rather a kind of, there's something mysterious about our existence, right? And that, to me, that's what he's talking about here, which again is not blind faith. It's not this kind of category of blind faith and we don't understand and we shouldn't bother looking into our existence. No, it's a very deep existential experience, okay, that touches a place, we call it our souls, okay, but touches a very deep space within us that we can't explain through words, okay, or through categories. All right, I'm taking it now to the next point. What is distinctive about the Yirei Shamayim, he's talking about a category of people that he calls Yirei Shamayim, is not merely a distinctive object of awe, an explicitly religious object. Also distinctive, and my focus for the present, is the steadiness. That is the steadiness that the Yirei Shamayim has achieved. Okay, so what he's saying here is, and he's very specific, he's saying here, it's not about those one moments of awe. That's not what it's about. He says, because you can have that moment of awe, you can have that moment of mystery, you can have that standing at the mountain and God coming down at Har Sinai. The question is, what do we do with those moments? Right? How do we develop those moments into our character? And that's what he wants to talk about here. It's the steadiness, not those awe moments. Or, whilst not a constant companion, has become characteristic of everyday experience. It is not only a question of frequency. The Yirei Shamayim lives in the presence of awe, a kind of background condition against which he carries on. Nor is it only awe that has become characteristic and habitual. With awe come the godlike tendencies to feeling and behavior. This perspective, Sarah.
Yes,
Thank you. The gratitude. I need you in all my classes. Moreover, since awe engenders a sense of holy, to characteristically feel awe is to be confronted by the holy in all sorts of unlikely places. The Yirei Shamayim lives quite a different life than those of us for whom awe is both rare and transitory. How might one go about configuring such a life? I'm just going to stop for a minute. Does everyone understand what he's saying here? He's saying here that it's not just about those one moments of awe, or those moments of mystery, or that moment of standing by the Grand Canyon. It's the ability to take those moments, integrate them into my being and my character, and then be able to see those moments in everything. Now, I'll just give you a tiny example. Not that I've nowhere, definitely don't define myself as Yirei Shamayim in that sense, because I've got a lot of work to do in that sense. But just for example, the other day I was walking, I told this to my other class, the other day I was walking in Bar Ilan, and there was like in the middle of where the road is, there were these most gorgeous wild flowers, loads of different colours, gorgeous. And for a second, I had that awe moment. I didn't even take a picture because I felt like I couldn't capture it. I didn't want to capture it. I wanted to just love it. But then last week when I went back again, I have to take a picture of it to show them. So I showed the class a picture of it. But that like appreciation that, yeah, you can explain, like, of course you can explain the seeds dropped, this happened, they grew here, whatever. But that's not the point. The minute I explain it, I take away my ability to see the holy in something that is everyday. And I think that's really what he's talking about here, okay? Perhaps what makes the whole thing so hard to imagine, okay? So he says, how do we go about configuring such a life? Perhaps what makes the whole thing so hard to imagine is that we are thinking about a kind of quick transitions, a quick fix. Instead, perhaps we should think about something much more slow and painstaking, something more like character development. Okay, it's not something that happens overnight. Okay, what is required is God's help. It comes in the form of inherited practices of thousands of years standing, practice that conduce to Yirat Shamayim. The necessary character development is the product of socialization and training. It is a product of engagement with religious practice. Okay, so here he brings in, and again, I've cut and pasted. I mean, he speaks much more. I wish I could have brought the whole chapter, right, if we had time. But what he's saying here is, it's about a character development. It's about a process. It's about a life journey. It's about constantly working on yourself. It's about taking the moments of awe and integrating them into my character. But also it's about recognizing that religious practice, when engaged with in the right way, is meant to bring about a sense of Yirat Shamayim. Okay, that it's not just behavioralism, it's not just praxis. Okay, it is the ability to integrate those religious experiences and those religious commands into something more. Okay. Footnote, here's interesting, on faith and belief. Faith, as I'm using this, is quite different to belief. This is going to be very important for us later on, okay? Faith is not a matter of assent to or conviction about propositions. Interestingly, the Hebrew word usually translated to faith, emunah, has quite different meaning from belief. Emunah conveys commitment, trust, a steadiness and affirmation, and perhaps even something like a sense of living in the presence of God. Okay, now this is his footnote. I brought it because it's going to be very important for us when we talk about how do we fight Amalek. Okay, those of you that already know the text will remember that Moshe's arms are Yodei Emunah. Okay, we're going to get to that, but I want us just to remember this for a minute. Okay, yeah, sure.
What is faith? He says what it isn't.
So exactly this, trust, commitment, trust, steadiness and affirmation, and even something like living a sense in the presence of God. That's what faith is. That's what emunah means. Emunah means to be Yirat Elokim. That's what he's saying, right? Emunah isn't just a belief in certain propositions about God. It's living in the presence of God. How do I live in the presence of God? When I integrate the ideas of awe and mystery and holiness into my being. That's what he means by emunah. Okay, it's not an overnight thing. It's something we constantly work on. Okay, in other words, there's a sense here of musar. There's a sense of like working on my midot, working on my awareness, working on my, as Heschel calls it, on my radical amazement. Okay, on being the ability to be radically amazed, the ability to see awe, to see mystery, to take those huge moments and integrate them into my everyday life. That's what he's talking about here. Okay, for example. No, belief, he says, is a Christian idea. It's not related to Judaism. Judaism is not a religion of belief. Judaism is a religion of emunah. There's no word for belief in the Torah. There's only emunah. And emunah means trust. Emunah means living in the presence of God. Emunah means, you'll see in a minute, we'll develop what emunah means. But what he says is the whole idea of propositional belief is totally alien to Judaism. Unfortunately, it came into Judaism, and thank God we have the Rambam to thank for a lot of things. But one of the things we don't have the Rambam to thank for is his 13 principles of faith, which really made Judaism into a dogmatic religion. What was that? Yeah, that's his, exactly.
Yeah, but he was only building on a variety of different lists of dogma that he decided to codify and try and give one and say some were more important than others.
But I don't want to get 100%. I don't want to get into the Rambam. There's a million books that have been written. Why? Because Dafka, his 13 principles of faith are actually totally in contradiction to a lot of the other things that he writes, which is very surprising. Okay, and there's what's his name's got an amazing, Menachem Kahne's got an amazing book called Must You Believe Anything, which he basically unpicks the whole of Rambam's 13 principles of faith and shows how the Rambam is, how we read the Rambam wrong, and we're not meant to take them as propositional faith and everything else. There's a million different things we can, I don't want to get into it now, it's a whole different dynamic on its own, but, and I brought the Rambam as a next source, right? But I will say that read in the way that it has been read, unfortunately it has created a sense of dogmatic religion in Judaism. There's no question that came as a corollary to the 13 principles of faith. Okay, Rambam here says something similar, not similar, but I felt I had to bring, because it spoke to me did I bring you translation? No, okay. V'hayech ki haderech lahavato v'yirato. Okay, so know that the way to loving and fearing God, b'sha'ah she'yitbonen ha'adam b'ma'asav u'bor'av ha'nifla'im ha'gdolim, that when man, and here the word is very important, yitbonen. Yitbonen here doesn't just mean to look. Yitbonen literally means to, contemplate, ponder. What's the word I'm looking for? Almost, when I when I do like this, meditate, almost to meditate on it, okay, on his actions and his creator and the greatness of created things, right? As in wonders. He literally uses the word wonders here. V'yir'eh mihen chachmato, and he will see from those, or he will become fearful. You could read it either way. The chachmato she'ein la erech. He will see the greatness, the wisdom, the wisdom that has no thank you for translating, no untold wisdom. Okay, lo ketz miyad hu ohev u'mushabach u'mefa'er mitaveh ta'ava gdola liyadei Hashem hagadol, and he will come to this unmeasurable love and praising and desire, great desire. Liyadeh Hashem Hagadol, to know God, Kamosha Amar David, Sam'an Nafshi Elokim, and he quotes it, David in Tehillim, that I desire, I crave, I thirst for God. Or Kashemechashev B'dvarim Ha'elu Atzmam Miyad hu nirta la'acharav yifached v'yodea shehu bria ktana shvela afela omedet b'da'at kala Okay, so he will, once he has this like unbelievable thirst for God, this unbelievable desire to know God, he will then suddenly realize, and again, this he's describing here literally how Wettstein describes an awe experience, right? He will suddenly realize, I am a nothing, small, tiny being, okay, standing before this enormous creator, and all of a sudden it will give me these feelings of nothingness and of awe and mystery. That's what we're talking about here. Kamosha Amar David, and then he quotes David. Now, what Rambam here is speaking is he's speaking medieval language. Okay, he's also speaking. Well, of course, we have to know that Rambam's speaking. Rambam, the highest level of knowing God is what's called the active intellect, and it's all about the intellect. But what's interesting is here he's not necessarily talking about the intellect, and this is what fascinates me more than anything. That here Rambam is dafka saying that there is an experience of Yirat Elokim that is not necessarily explainable, right? And that's what to me is fascinating about this. It dafka goes against what the Rambam, and by the way, that's not surprising because this is the Mishnah Torah, and in Moreh Nevuchim, he's much more goes along the philosophical, active intellect kind of way. But here he's talking about this idea of really, to me, it sounds exactly as Wettstein describes, this kind of awe experience, okay? Now, Yirat Elokim in the Torah. I want to go through the various places where we see it. Number one in Bereshit, okay, which we already did together, but I'm going to read it again. V'yomer Avimelech, remember, Abraham goes down to Gra and he pretends that Sarah is his sister. When down in Gra and he's pretending that Sarah is his sister, the Avimelech, the king of Gra, takes Sarah, and before he's able to do anything to her, God comes in a dream and says to her, she is the wife of Abraham, do not touch her, okay? And he then comes to Abraham and says to Abraham, why did you tell me she was your sister? Okay. And here's very interesting exactly how the wording is. And this is what I want to try and understand. Mara'ita kiyasita tadavar zeh. Okay, the language here is very, very interesting. He turns around to Abraham and he says, what did you see that caused you to say such a thing? Okay. And here again, the word seeing, and we've spoken about this as well, the yira and yireh can be interchangeable. They're the same, they're different roots because it's tet resh aleph is to see and yud resh aleph is to fear. But but they are used the same letters, and in a lot of places, a lot of people say that they're interchangeable. So here again, he's saying, what did you see that caused you to do this? V'yoma Avraham ki amalti, because I said, rak ein yirat Elokim b'makom hazeh, v'harguni al davar ishti. I said that there wasn't any God's fear is in this place and they're going to kill me on the account of my wife, okay? Now, I didn't bring it for you, but it even continues further where Abraham turns around and he says, he starts making excuses, right? I said this to you last time, I think. He starts saying, well, she is kind of like my sister because she's my niece, and he goes through stuff. But what we see here is that Abraham's found himself in a pickle. Okay, he's found himself in a pickle, and in order to get out of the pickle, what he's done is to turn around and say, you know what, it's your fault. Okay? Seriously, you've proven to me just by looking around that the people here are not God-fearers. Okay? What we're trying to do here is develop the idea of what God-fearing is in the Torah. So that's the first place. The second place is with Yosef and the brothers. Okay? When the brothers come down, v'yosef otam mishmash shlosha yamim, v'yomer alehem Yosef b'yom hashishi, zot asu v'chayu. He says to them, he gathers them all together, and he says to them, come down to the prison house. I'm going to put you here to wait a minute. But this is what, on the third day he comes down, he says, you need to do this and you will live. Et ha'elokim ani yireh. Okay, which is ani yareh. Okay, which is a very strange thing for him to say to the brothers. What's he saying to them?
It's like I swear you.
It's more, I don't think it's like I swear. Yes, he is saying to them, I swear to you that I'm not going to do anything to you. Or he's saying the condition is, but in order, so what he's trying to do is to prove his worthiness, his trustworthiness. He says to them, you can trust me because I fear God. Okay? Because I fear God. Im kenimach atem achichem echad yatzor bebet mishmarchem v'atem lechu v'yu shever ra'avon betechem. He wants to send them back home, but he wants to take one of them to keep. And we know the whole story that happens here. How does he prove to them that his word is going to be his word? By turning around and saying, I am God-fearing. Okay? Second, and don't forget, they don't know that he's Yosef. They think he's an Egyptian, okay? Third, V'yomer Elehem Yosef, and this is at the end now. This is when he turns around to the brothers, and the brothers are very, very fearful. Why are they fearful? He's going to take revenge, okay? After they find out who he is, he thinks that they killed him or put him in the thing, and in the bowl, and he turns around and he says, V'yomer Yosef, Al tira'u ki hatachat Elokim ani. He says to them, do not fear. Am I in place of God? Okay? ואתם חשבתם עליי רעה, האלוקים חשבה לטובה, למען נעשה כיום הזה לחיות עם רב. Okay, so that's the third place. The fourth place we see. The first place is the case of Avimelech. The second place is the case of Yosef in two different places. The third is the case of the midwives in Shmot. The Yomel, remember the midwives who are commanded by Paro to kill all the firstborn children. V'yoma b'yaldachen et ha'evriyot ura'iten al havanim. Very interestingly, by the way, the whole narrative of Al-Havnaim, thank you. The whole narrative of Perek Aleph and Bet, the word v'tereh, or the root word tereh, comes up again and again and again and again. Okay? And if you saw them on the stones, in benhu v'himatanotov, in batu v'chaya, v'tira'en hamiladot et ha'elokim. It's almost identical, but it's not. Okay? Because one is saying when you see the babies on the stones, and the others is saying they feared God. Okay? Okay, so what in this case again, what do we see? We see that they don't listen. Do we know, by the way, if they're Jewish or not, the midwives?
No.
We don't know. Okay, Rashi comes, or the Midrash comes and says that they were who was Shifra and Pua. Shifra and Pua, in fact, Yocheved and Miriam. Okay, but in the Pshat, they're called Shifra and Pua, which sound like very Egyptian names. Okay, so they're not necessarily Jewish. Okay. But yet they feared God and they didn't do what Paro had told them to do. And then I brought for you the last part of the chapter 2 in Sefer Shemot. I wanted to just show to you what's going on there. Who is that? It's Yocheved. She gives birth and she sees that he is good and she hides him for 3 months. Again, if you notice here, there's a lot of, what's a theme that keeps coming up in all of these things? Hiding. People's identities that are hidden, people that are not who they are, okay, things that are being hidden all the time.
There's also a thread of Egypt running through everything. Is that
for sure? Okay. That 100%. I saw that as well. I don't know what I think about that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have time to do it today, but I think that all goes back also to what Sarah spoke about last time, which is the na, kach na et bencha, which relates back to Sarah in Hagar, to Sarah being asked to hide her identity when they go down to Mitzrayim. I think the whole of the Akedah narrative is intertwined with the whole story of Hagar, of them going down to Mitzrayim at the beginning. That was the defining moment where something went wrong in their relationship, and something went wrong with Abraham there. And in the way that Akedah is a tikkun for all of those things. And I think the whole Yirat Elokim, but it's not 100% related here to what's happening for our story, which is Purim, but I do think that there's something very profound there for sure, 100%. Okay, ותראה אותו כי טוב לפני שלושה ימים, ותראה בפרעה ללחוץ על היער, ונערותיה הולכה על יד יער, ותראה את התיבה בתוך הצוף. Again, she sees it, ותשלח המטה, ותפתח ותראהו. Again, there's something being hidden. The child is inside the basket hidden. She opens it and she sees, okay? And then, this is very, very interesting. I've done this so many times, I only just noticed it now as well. This is Moshe, okay? Moshe comes after he's grown up and everything else. There are 3 v'terez in the previous story about saving Moshe. The first is the v'tira'en hamiladot. The second is v'tere Yocheved sees him, and the third is Bat Paro. And then look what happens with Moshe. He comes and he out to his brothers. He sees their suffering. He sees an Egyptian smiting an Israelite. three V'yirez are parallel to the three V'terez, that he essentially learns the ability to see things differently, to feel suffering, to take action. He learns the ability of Yirat Elokim from his three mothers, okay? Which is, I think, very, very profound here, okay? And by the way, even more so if we say that Shifra and Pua were Miriam and Yocheved, then Mamash, it goes even more to the point, okay? Now, this story in itself is fascinating because what happens here is he sees this happening. He has no external command telling him what to do. Everything that is happening here with Moshe is happening internally. There's no one coming telling him what, Dafka, the opposite. According to Paro, what's happening is absolutely fine, okay? But he has this kind of, and this is where we're going to begin to develop what Yirat Elokim may be. He has an inner voice, a kind of conscience that is speaking to him, the ability to see, the ability to know that something is beyond, that there's a mystery, that there's an awe, that there's a presence that exists in this world. That is not everything that I see is what there is, okay? And here he does something fascinating. In the midst of this suffering that he is seeing, he takes action and he kills the Mitzri and he buries him in the sand. Again, what we're seeing here is hiding. Okay, hiding. And don't forget, by the way, obviously, and this obviously probably popped up in your heads already, but the whole of Purim is based around hiding. Okay. Masks. ויצא ביום השני והנה שני אנשים עברים ניצים ויאמר לרשע למה תכה רעך. And now he comes and he acts as the conscience. He acts as the people's conscience, and he turns around to them and he says, why are you doing this? And what do the people turn around to him and say? ויאמר מי שמך לאיש שר ושופט עלינו? We don't need anyone coming to telling us what to do. We don't need an external voice coming. We've got enough of those. We don't need a conscience coming and telling us what to do. Okay? And he runs away. Okay. And by the way, it says, V'yirah Moshe, he feared. Okay, which again is, and he runs away. Now, the final thing I want to show you comes in our narrative that we've been studying, and that's the Akedah. Look at source number 8. Okay? ויאמר אליו האלוקים בחלום, גם אנוכי ידעתי כי באתם לבבך עשית, קיוויתם לבבך עשית זאת. Sorry. This is Avimelech. Okay, this is when God comes to Avimelech in the dream, and he says to him, I know that you're a simple heart, meaning I know that you're pure, right? And you did this out of pure intention, meaning you didn't know that she was married to Abraham. But I've saved you, I've withheld you from doing this immoral act. Okay? And therefore I've stopped you from touching her. Who does the withholding here? God. God comes as an external voice, very clearly in a dream, as the conscience, as the moral imperative, and comes and says to Abraham, to Avimelech. My mind is already going where I'm taking this. I'm like trying to think forwards, and I'm like not focusing on the minute. Comes to Avimelech and saying to him, I'm saving you. Right? You could not do this on your own for whatever reason, because you've been giving the wrong information, because your conscience isn't working, whatever it happens, because because your moral intuition isn't developed enough. You have not been able to recognize for itself that this is wrong. I'm coming as an external voice. Look at what happens in the Akedah. Oh, sorry. This was... Oh, right, I bought the whole thing again for you. I don't know why I bought it twice. That was a mistake. Tom. So he bought the whole thing again. Fine. And we've read that already. Okay, now look at the Akedah, which is... Oh, no, before we get to the Akedah, I told you you're guinea pigs, so you're going to have to bear with me, okay? Before we get to the Akedah, I want to just go through a few things that... commonalities with all of these, what makes them all similar, and then look at the differences. So, firstly... what's happening there's something fascinating about the fact that in almost all of these instances, I think in all of them, someone is hiding something. There's either an identity being hidden, or there's someone being physically hidden. Someone's hiding something in all of these, or they have been hidden. For example, Yosef, at that time, his identity was hidden when he first speaks to them, and then afterwards, he's revealed himself, okay? Even, I would take it even further, the whole idea of him being hidden in the bowl and coming out and the coat, and there's a million things with Yosef that is also about hiding and revealing all the time, okay? That's the one thing. The second thing is, in each of these circumstances, the people, the actors themselves, seem to be acting in an environment that has an antipathy to their moral intuition, or the moral ethical code that they're trying to follow. Okay, so I'll give you an example. The midwives, obviously, are going against what they're listening to kind of a moral conscience where they're being told the opposite. What's his name? Yosef, in the Egyptian, he's living in a very kind of probably immoral society, and he turns around and he says, you can trust me because I'm moral. I'm Yirat Elokim, okay? The case of the midwives, and the case obviously of Avimelech in Gra. Okay, so all of them are acting in some kind of environment that isn't necessarily a moral one. All of them are acting around, there's a lot of non-Jewish, and in most of these cases, the people who are acting are dafka not necessarily Jewish, or not necessarily from the Israelite tradition. Okay, Yosef happens to be, that was one, but Avimelech, Moshe, who grew up, at the time he himself doesn't even know he's Jewish, right? The midwives, okay? So that's also very, very interesting. One second. And okay, and the word tereh or yirah seem to be connected in many of these instances as well. Okay, what are the differences? I think that the biggest difference, I'm going to see in a minute, comes with the Akedah, which we're going to talk about. But I think that more than that, the Akedah, where in the end he doesn't slaughter his son when he realizes that God wants him to stop, okay, is the ability, and why are the words tereh and yireh all the time interactive? Because when I have Yirat Elokim, it means I have the ability to see something beyond. Okay, to see something beyond. Okay, to see something that isn't at face value. Okay, that things are not at face value. Now, if we think about the whole of Purim, that's what the whole idea of Purim is. The whole idea of Purim, the whole idea of the Megillah, is that God is not there, but God is there. Okay, the whole idea of covering and uncovering. By the way, when you read the Megillah, the halacha is that the Megillah has to be open so that you see the whole picture. Because if you only see the parts of the picture, there's not a whole picture that you can't see. Meaning, to me, the notion, and this is why I wanted to develop the notion of Yirat Elokim, is purposely the words, the literary kind of the literary evidence in the examples that I brought for you show us that in order to be Yirat Elokim, you have to have the ability, lirot, to see. Okay? That there has to be some kind of seeing that's going on here. Now, all of the people we see in these circumstances are working against an external law. They're dafka coming against the external commands that has been imposed on them. And instead, they're listening to what? To some kind of internal voice. Okay? But the question is, how do we develop that internal voice? And let's just have a look at Avraham at the Akedah, because as you know, one of the things I really believe in terms of the Akedah is the entire development, all the nisyonot, all the tests that Avraham goes through, climax with the Akedah, because at that moment, when he doesn't send his hands on the child, when he hears Al Tishlach Yadcha Al Hanal, at that moment when he hears the ambiguity of the malach, and by the way, if we take the idea that the malach very often represents an idea of an inner voice as opposed to an external command, then when he hears that malach, what he has developed, what Avraham has finally developed, is the ability to hear his inner conscience, as opposed to having to respond to an external command. And that development happens the whole way through until he gets to the point where he can do it for himself. And from that moment forth, God doesn't speak to him anymore, because he's he's able to do it on his own. Look at the text. I know we've done this so many times, just to get a feel of it. V'yomer Avraham, v'yomer hineni, v'yomer al tishachata lana, al taslamo uma, ki ata yadati ki yireh Elokim ata, v'lo chasachta et bincha yechidecha mimeni. Who withholds from, I want to read this as the opposite of what happened with Avimelech. With Avimelech, God says, I had to chasach, I had to stop you, I had to withhold you. Here God is saying to Avraham, you withheld. Now there's a double negative here. It can be read as v'lo chasachta et bincha. You didn't withhold your son, but you can also read it double negatives make a positive. When you have two double negatives, v'lo chasachta, you didn't withhold, both of which are negatives. You didn't withhold, meaning you withheld. You stopped yourself from killing your son. You stopped yourself from killing your son, and that's your greatness. You didn't need, like Avimelech did, an external command to come and tell you. You heard it within yourself, and you stopped yourself. You didn't need me to stop you. Okay, it's a totally different reading.
I don't understand, but it says, Al tishlach etcha lana. Somebody told him.
Okay, so what we've been developing over the last month is the idea that the whole of the Akedah story, from the very first command, is ambiguous. The Zohar, for example, says that the command of the Akedah came in like a misty glass, meaning it wasn't like all the other commands that were very clear, that he heard with clarity. The command for the Akedah, and especially the command at the end when the Malach comes, is very, very ambiguous, to the point that almost he didn't even have to hear it. But the fact that he chose to hear the Malach come at the end and say to him, don't send your hand, and the fact that he chose to see, and we're going to see in a second, he sees the ram in the thicket, he sees the ayal, he sees the ram, and he doesn't have to see it because it's all, you could choose not to see it. He lifted up his eyes, the ability to know, ultimately, that the voice I heard at the beginning telling me to kill my son is actually not the correct voice, and the voice I want to hear is the voice of Malach telling me not to. And I'm about to go and do it, but I managed to stop myself at that moment because I'm not, the passion I have for killing, or the passion I have for listening to the voice, I'm not listening to the voice because I want to kill my son. I'm listening to the voice because I believe that's what I've heard, until I realize that's not what I've heard. And in fact, what I'm really hearing is, Al tishlach yadcha lana. So in essence, what I'm saying is that external command is not a clear external command. In some ways, it almost becomes something internal. And I have to find out where, but someone once told me that they heard this idea that every time a malach comes in the Torah, it's in many ways, it's a reflection of an inner voice as opposed to something external. Okay?
That's Rambam.
Is it the Rambam? I'd love to find the source. Okay, so the Rambam talks about it. And I think that if we look, I think it has a lot of truity to it, obviously. Okay, and that's essentially what's going on here, is that it's almost his internal conscience, having been built up, all of it, having gone through this journey of learning, which we developed, he's managed to get to that point where he's able to stop himself because he hears the voice. Now, even if you look, right, אל תשכח אל תעשה לו מה כי אתה ידעתי כי ירא אלוקים אתה ולא חסכת את מיכה יחידך ממני ויישא אברהם את עיניו וירא והנה איל אחר נאחז בסבך בקרניו וילך אברהם ויקח אליו ויעלהו לעולה תחת בנו. And he lifts his eyes up. The ability to lift my eyes up, the ability to see something in a place where other people don't see, that is part and parcel of Yirat Elokim. That's what Yirat Elokim means. Okay, and then he calls the place Hashem Yira'eh. And to me, that is the culmination of this idea. Meaning, what's he saying here? Hashem will show me. Okay, Hashem will show me. Meaning, Hashem, so they translate as the mount where Hashem is seen. Okay, but I think that's exactly what Yirat Elokim is. It's the ability to see God in places where other people can't necessarily, okay? And to understand what the consequences of the presence of God is for my day-to-day being. That's what Yirat Elokim is. Now, who are Amalek? Amalek, I knew this would happen, okay? We've got to really kind of... Amalek is the antithesis of Yirat Elokim. Look what happens. Look at source number 10. Hinei omed lefanecha sham al No. 1 minute.
11 you want? No, 10.
Yes. Okay. הנני עומד לפניך שם על הצור בחורב, והכית בצור ויצאו ממנו מים ושתה העם, ויעש כמשה לעיני זקני ישראל. ויקרא שם המקום מסע ומריבה, על ריב בני ישראל ונשאותם את השם לאמור, היש השם בקרבנו עם עין. Just before Amalek come and attack Bnei Israel, they complain to Moshe, they say we don't have water. Moshe stands, he hits the rock at the top of the mountain, water comes out, and the people turn around and they say, why do they call the place Masah Merubah? Because it was there that the people turned around and said, is Hashem bikirbeinu, which badly translates as amongst us, but it does not mean amongst us. Bikirbeinu means within us. Okay, if you remember when Sarah laughs bikirba, she laughs internally. Is God within us? Now, to me, what the people are saying here is what? The people have only known God through external commands. That's all they've known. He took them out of Mitzrayim. He tells them to do this. He external command and obvious, clear visions of miracles. Not anything hidden. Everything's very clear. At this point, what are they asking? What are they suggesting? That actually, the question here is not about God. The question here is about themselves. The question they're asking here is, can we survive on our own without the external commands? Without all the externalities? Do we have an element of godliness within us? Bikirbeinu. Hayesh Hashem bikirbeinu im ayin. Okay, and then what happens? Then Amalek comes. Why does Amalek come? Zachor et asher aseh Amalek b'derech. This is from Devarim. B'tzeitchem miMitzrayim asher kercha b'derech v'yiznav b'cha kol hanechashalim acharecha v'ata ayef v'yaga v'lo yireh Elokim. Now, again, this is very interesting because it's very ambiguous. The Yirat Elokim here could be either attached to Yisrael or to Amalek. Now, generally people translate it as being attached to Amalek. The Amalek were not God-fearing, and there's a beautiful midrash we're going to read in Nehemiah, name of its quotes in a minute. There's a beautiful midrash that talks about the idea, why were they not God-fearing? Because everyone else feared the people of Israel. They'd heard about all the miracles that God had done, and they feared to go near them. But they almost talk about it like Amalek jumped into a boiling cauldron, right? He literally jumped in. He said, I don't fear these people. And he runs and he attacks them. But there's an element of Yirat Elokim here also for the people of Israel. And there's another commentator, I can't remember who it is. I think it's Chizkuni. I'm not 100% sure. And he talks here about the idea that why are they not Yirat Elokim? Number one, because but more than that, what do we see? Where are all the weak people? At the back. Okay, if you were true Yirei Elokim, you would not put your weak at the back. You would be protecting them. Yirat Elokim means exactly what we spoke about. It means a whole, it's not just about a command, it's not just about behavioralism, it's not just about ticking the boxes of what I've done and I've not done. It's a whole body, whole presence experience that I am a person with moral codes, that I know it is wrong to leave all my weak people at the back that can be attacked. Okay, when we talked about the idea of Hashem taking us out on Konfei Nesharim, why Konfei Nesharim? Why is the Neshel, why is the eagle used as the imagery of God taking us out in Mitzrayim? Because the Neshel holds his children where? On his wings. Why? Because he goes above all the other birds, whereas all the other ones hold them here because they're scared that the other birds are going to attack them, right? The Konfei Nesharim is essentially the idea that, and this is what the people didn't have. The people didn't have the ability to have a presence of mind to recognize that they needed to protect those that needed protecting. And what we're going to see, which is even more fascinating, is the other places in the Torah where we are told about Yirat Elokim are exactly places where we need to protect people that can't protect themselves. For example, where else do we see Yirat Elokim? Actually, I'll just show it to you now. Why not? Look at source number 16. לא תקלל חרש ולפני עיוור לא תיתן מכשול ויראת מאלוקיך אני השם. Do not put a stumbling block, do not curse a deaf person and put a stumbling block before a blind man, because you should fear God. It's not because you should, why not? And another place, by the way, Malachi, look at source 17. Look at 17. וקרבתי אליכם למשפט והיית עד ממהר במחשבכם ובנאפים ובנשביעים לשקר ובעוסקי שכיר אלמנה ויתום ומטה וגר לא יראוני אמר השם צבאות. Okay? I will come near to you to judge you. Again, he gives all the various things, but the very important thing here is the people that oppress those that they've hired, okay, that oppress the widow and the father, and they turn the stranger aside from them. Those are the people who are not fear God-fearing. Why? Why these examples? Because these are examples where no one can take revenge on them, meaning they're not fearful of a punishment from anyone. They're not fearful that someone's going to find out. No one can. The blind man doesn't know who put the stumbling block there. The deaf person doesn't know that the other person's thing. The person who you're paying wages to is obviously far less equal to you, and therefore, all of these people are people who cannot defend themselves. Meaning what? Meaning, if you are only fulfilling the external commands because you are ticking a box, okay, because you are simply doing the practice without internalizing it, these things are not going to bother you. But if you have internalized what Yirat Elokim is, if you live in the presence of God all the time, no matter what, if you are constantly awestruck and you are constantly living with the mystery and you're constantly seeing the beauty and the gratitude and all that whole persona that is Yirat Elokim, you wouldn't even think to do this. If you were Yirat Elokim, these things, you wouldn't leave your week behind. So we can read that idea of Yirat Elokim and Amalek two ways. On the one hand, it's true, Amalek was not Yirat Elokim at all. But in some ways, neither were the people, because they asked the question, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbenu? They didn't understand that God has to be within as much as he has to be without. Okay, and that is the key to the development of Yirat Elokim. Look at what Nechama Leibovitz says in source number 12. All the wonders and the miracles of Egypt and the Red Sea had come to publicize the omnipotence of God. Indeed, when the children of Israel went out to Egypt, all the nations of the world, with the exception of Amalek, were seized with dread and awe. Okay, and that's the beginning. The beginning is to have dread and awe, and then one develops Yirat Elokim. But what happens? The people have heard, they tremble. The mighty men of Moab are seized by fright. The people of Canaan melt away. Terror and dread fill upon them. Mankind as a whole might have taken one great step forward and acknowledged the sovereignty of God, of justice and truth. Says Nechama Leibovitz, in other words, that awe, that mystery, that almost that dread, that feeling of humility that all the other nations felt is the beginning of the development of Yirat Elokim, which all these nations could have potentially developed, however. But then came along Amalek, unrestrained by the dread and the awe that kept all the nations in the world in check, jumped, as it were, to use the Midrashic expression, into the boiling cauldron. What was there to fear? They were wandering in the wilderness, weary and struggling. Why should they not be attacked and spoiled? This is the way of the world. In this manner, the moment of awe at the mighty hand of God passed away, and the atmosphere of astonishment at his miracles evaporated. The world returned to the idols of gold and silver, its faith in mortal power, and brute force. The force, maybe, yeah. The opportunity had been lost, and who was responsible? Amalek. And in another place, by the way, where she develops the idea of Yirat Elokim in Parasha Ekev, she says, accordingly, fear of God is no small matter. On the contrary, its possession constitutes a very high spiritual achievement indeed, which Abraham attained only after withstanding all his trials. By the way, I found this source after I developed the whole shiur, right? And I was like, yes! Indeed, God does not demand from us this supreme standard, but as Albo explains, he demands of us the fulfillment of his will in daily acts, in the grey routine of our 24-hour living. It is the latter which will gradually lead us to a higher plane of fear. There's no doubt that Nechama Leibovitz definitely had not read Howard Wetstein, and there's also no doubt, I don't think, because she never, ever quotes him, she may have, but I think it's unlikely that she had read Heschel as well. And yet what she says here is exactly what Wetstein and Heschel say, and that is this idea of Yirat Elokim being an all-encompassing, the whole of man. Kol ha'adam. It's an all-encompassing, it's not just one thing or this thing, it's a whole-encompassing experience. Look at Heschel in source number 13. Before we look at Heschel, why is Amalek the antithesis of Yirat Elokim? Because he, in some ways, emasculates man to such a low level, right, that they don't anymore have the capacity to be radically amazed. That's essentially what Nachman Levitz is saying here. The capacity for radical amazement, okay, is premised on the idea of mystery and awe. But as soon as you take away the mystery and awe, which is what Amalek does, you don't have that capacity anymore. Look at Heschel. Faith in God cannot be forced upon man. The issue is not only lack of faith, but the vulgarization of faith, the misunderstanding and abuse of freedom. Awe, reverence precedes faith. It is the root of faith. We must grow in awe in order to reach faith. So again here, faith is not the idea of what we were speaking about before, what Wetzstein says. Faith is not the idea of propositional statements, of religious propositions. Faith is the idea of emunah, which essentially means everything that he spoke about, okay? Trust and building of personality and character development. We must be guided by awe to be worthy of faith. Awe is the beginning and gateway of faith, the first precept of all, and upon the whole world is established. God's voice may sound feeble in our conscience. Here he uses the word conscience. The spirit is a still, small voice. And the masters of vulgarity use loudspeakers. I think that is just such a profound sentence. I read that. I was like, right, the spirit is, and here he's clearly talking about what still small voice is he talking about here? Kol Madaka, where Eliyahu stands on the mountain and he says God is not in the earthquakes and not in the fire and not in the, and God is in the Kol Madaka. And where is that Kol Madaka? Where does that Kol Madaka start? Bikirbeinu. That's where it starts, within us, right? That's the Kol Madaka, right? But the masters of vulgarity speak on loudspeakers. The voice has been stifled, and many of us have lost faith in the possibility of new perceptiveness. Discredited is man's faith in his own integrity. And this is exactly what I'm trying to develop here. What I want us to understand is that, to me, the way that I see it, Yirat Elokim is the development of conscience, but not just conscience on the level that we're talking about, an internal human conscience. Conscience in its entirety, in its whole character development, in its idea that God is within us. It's not just human conscience, it's a divine conscience that we have implanted, that we have the ability to connect to tap into, through awe, through reverence, through all the experiences that we develop as mankind. And that Abraham had to reach that point at the Akedah to recognize the voice of Al Tishlach Yadcha Lanal. Look, I found also, while I was looking through this, I found a book online by someone called Howard Schulwitz. Do you know him? Ah, fabulous. I knew someone would know him. Okay. So it's a really fascinating book. Again, I could have bought tons of it, but I'm just going to bring one small thing that he talks about. He also develops this idea. Again, this was after I had gone through this whole thought process. After I've developed an idea, I often look online to see if someone else has said it somewhere, right? And he develops this whole idea of Yirat Elokim and the idea of conscience. And he says the following: the Jewish understanding of the fear of God bears connotations different from other theological outlooks. For Judaism, fear of God suspends the unethical command and liberates the believer from the bondage of scriptural literalness. Paradoxically, it is the fear of God that frees the believer from the excesses of the fear of the Torah. Okay, he, by the way, I think he's actually, is he Reform conservative? Maybe not. Is he Orthodox? A Reconstructionist, right? Okay. Too close an identity of God and Torah stifles the critical conscience of human beings. But in essence, what he's saying is very similar to what I've been trying to say, which is the idea that if one just attaches oneself to the external commands without understanding that the command itself is there in order to develop an inner conscience, then one disconnects God from the command. For many, God and conscience are the opposites, and to choose one is to surrender the other. In our view, fear of God is fear of self-betrayal, of the self gifted with moral judgment. To suppress conscience is to ignore the core divine human relationship. The proper fear of God is expressed in the love of moral conscience. Fear of God does not lead to mindless subservience, but to the exercise of compassionate intelligence. To fear God is to fear one's own moral cowardice. To fear God is to fear the human hardening of the heart. A conscienceless life fears no God. As we have earlier noted, okay, and that's what we saw in all the other examples, right? A conscienceless life fears no God. As we earlier noted, there is no biblical Hebrew word that translates conscience. I propose that the biblical term that comes closest to the character and role of conscience is Yirat Elokim. Conscience is the internal moral sense that remains when the formal conditions for halachic prosecution are absent. And that is exactly what we were talking about in terms of putting a stumbling block in front of a blind man, where there's no halachic constraints, when no one's seeing you doing it, when there's no fear of punishment. What remains within? And that's Yirat Elokim. Okay, it's dafka the opposite of what we usually.
Are we born with it, or is it has to come through?
So I don't want to get into that now. I think it's a bit of both. I think that we are. That's a whole massive topic. If we've got time, I'll address it at the end.
The opposite of
Oh, okay. One second. Alka, hold off. Just write your question down. I'm
The next one that we're running a few minutes.
Oh,
late.
Baruch Hashem. Okay, good. Top. Okay, so look, please, wait. I'm not answering any questions. Write them down. We'll address them at the end. Look at source number 18. The question is how. So the biggest question is, how do we fight the Amalekian worldview with Yirat Elokim? Right? How is Yirat Elokim an antidote, so to speak, for Amalek? So firstly, I want you to look at Buba, and then I'm going to look at the text where we literally do fight Amalek. Okay. Revelation is nothing less than the relation between giving and receiving. The law is not thrust upon man, it lies deep within him. Bikir Beinu. I keep coming back to it, but I see it everywhere, right? To awaken when the call comes. My own belief in Revelation does not mean that I believe that finished statements about God, again, the difference between belief and emunah, that finished statements about God were handed down from heaven to earth. Rather, it means that human substance is melted by the spiritual fire which visits it. And there now breaks forth from it a word, a statement which is human in its meaning and form, human conception and human speech, and yet witness to him who stimulated it and his will. That's what Revelation is. It's a law that's not thrust from the outside, but that is awakened from within. So yes, there's an element of it being there, but you have to develop it. It's the same as anything. Look, for example, look at Amalek. What happens when Amalek comes? V'yav Amalek v'yilachem im Yisrael b'refidim v'yomem Moshe el Yoshua b'chal lanu anashim v'tzei lachem b'Amalek mechal anochi nitzav al rosh hagivah u'matei Elokim biyadi. So go, and we're going to fight Amalek. He's going to stand at the top of the mountain. And what happens? Yoshua's fighting at the bottom. Moshe's standing at the top. Aaron and Hor either side of him. They all go up to the mountain. Pasuk Yud Aleph V'haya kasher yarim Moshe yado v'gava Yisrael v'kasher yanich yado v'gava Amalek. When his hands were lifted, they were victorious. When they were down, they weren't. Yadei Moshe kvedim, his hands were heavy. V'yichu evem yasimu tachtav v'yeshev alei, he sat down on a stone. V'Aaron v'chor tamchu b'yadav, and Aaron and Hor supported him, one side each. V'hi yadav emunah adva hashemesh. His hands were the hands of emunah. And here emunah is not propositional faith. It's not the 13 principles of faith. It's not that God is omniscient and omnipotent and everything else. It's not that I have to believe in Moshiach, and it's not that I have to believe X, Y, Z. Faith here is two things. Okay, and the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah talks about it, and they say, what Moshe's hands really miraculous? Did they really make or break war? And they said, no, there was no miracle there. When the people had kavanah and were l'shem shamayim, then they won, and when they didn't, when their eyes, again, the image here is their eyes being lifted upwards, which is the image that we see at the end of the Akedah, when Abraham lifts his eyes and sees the ayah. Again, what is going on here is this idea that Yirat Elokim, or Emunah, is the idea of trust. But it's not just trust in God. It's also trust in myself. Okay? It's trust that what I feel, what is intuitive within me, is sometimes right. And that I don't have to always rely on an external commands, on an external voice, on these strictures of frameworks, to sometimes know that there are things that I need to feel, there are things that I need to feel deep within that are right and wrong, that are not necessarily always going to be told to me from outside. That is what Abraham develops. That I want to believe is what all the people in the Torah that have Yirat Elokim do. The midwives, Yosef, Moshe, okay, that when he comes out and he sees what them hitting each other, which he had no one externally. Dafka external command was telling him don't, but he felt had this internal command within. That's what Yirat Elokim is. And I want to just show you why was Yoshua chosen, by the way. There's another, again, everything then comes up. Why was Yoshua chosen to fight Amalek? Why does the Midrash tell us? Lama Yoshua malazeknecha amar et Elokim ani yireh. Because Yoshua turned around, because Yoshua comes from Yosef, and Yosef said, Hashem Yira'eh, and who else comes from Yosef? Surprise, surprise. Mordechai is from Binyamin, is from the tribe of the same mother of Rachel. And by the way, Rachel also, I mean, we could go on and on. We could do a whole show on this because Rachel also has exactly those traits. Okay, but this is the idea of Mordechai and Esther being able to see something that others could not see, to be able to have this Yirat Elokim, this knowledge that even when the outside commands, when the Gzeirah of Haman is coming and saying, kill all the Jews, and everyone's agreeing and everyone's doing it, and Mordechai turns around and internally tears his external clothes, comes to Esther and says to her, and we have this, I bought the source for you, I'm just going to say it, but I'll pen source, I don't even know what source it is of yours. 25, right, one of the last sources. He comes and he says to Esther, Mi yode'im le'et kazot yigat le'malchut. He turns around to her and he says to her, I don't know why this is happening, but this gzeirah is happening, and I'm telling you, Esther, we have to look within ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, we have to look at the situation and say there is a reason why you're in the palace. And you can do something to help us. You have to listen to your inner voice. And remember, when Esther hears that Mordechai has come to the gates and he's in sackcloth, there's something bizarre that happens there, because the Torah says, the Nach tells us, v'techalchel Esther. Now, v'techalchel is a very, very, very strange word. Okay, it comes up, I think, very rarely. In fact, this may be one of the only times it comes up in Torah, and it literally comes from the word chalal. There was a vacuum, there was a chasm, there was an internal space within her that was empty. She didn't know. And that to me is that Hayesh Hashem b'kirvenu, right? And Mordechai turns around to her and says to her, you can do this. And then she fills that space up with Yirat Elokim. That's the only way I can describe it. She recognizes that there's something bigger here. And she says to him, there's something bigger here. She says, I will sacrifice, I will sacrifice myself because I recognize that there is a bigger picture here. That is again what the Purim story is telling us. I know, how long do I have?
Well, he's going to show.
Okay, as soon as he shows up, we'll finish. Okay, so just tell me when he's by the door. I really want to read. Okay, so you know what? Let's just, and by the way, another very interesting thing is at the end of the Pachad Elokim. Why it's so at the end of the Chol Medina v'Machol Eve'im Akom Asher Davar HaMelech D'Tato Magia Sasom v'Simcha LiYudim Mishteh v'Yom Tov v'Rabim Ma'amei Haaretz Mityahadim. They became Jewish. Ki Nafal Pachad HaYehudim Aleihem. Okay, which again is very interesting. And I just want to finish. I'm going to finish not with Natan Sharansky, which would be great to finish with, but read him in your own time. I brought him before. He talks exactly about this idea that he said to them before he leaves, you're so subservient to your external voices, to the people that are telling you what you are doing. I'm the one who's free because I'm listening to my internal voice, right? That's what Natan Sharansky says to him. But I want to finish again with Heschel. Look at source number 23. And obviously there's a million more things. For example, the very famous Gemara that Hashem held the mountain over them, because that was listening to the external commands. At that point they had no ability, they hadn't developed their Yirat Elokim. Only in the time of Achashverosh, when there's no external commands, when there's no obvious gods coming to them, then they've developed within them the ability to respond through conscience, through inner conscience rather than an external command. Look at Heschel. But how do we know what the right deeds are? Is the knowledge of right and wrong derived from reason and conscience alone? Okay, so this is what we're asking. What about the command? Is the command not important? There are those who are ready to discard the conscience of the divine commands and call upon us to rely on our own conscience. Those who call upon us to rely on our inner voice fail to realize that there is more than one voice within us. And this is the danger. And I had to read this because I think this is so important that we understand that I'm not turning around and saying we only rely on our conscience. No, okay? That the power of selfishness may easily subdue the pangs of conscience. The conscience is not a legislative power capable of teaching us what we ought to do, but rather a preventative agency, a brake, not a guide, a fence, not a way. And again, this reminds me of the Akedah where Abraham stops himself. Okay, but Abraham has developed his conscience so that it isn't self-interested. We already spoke about that it's not self-interested, and that's why the Akedah is the final test. It raises its voice after a wrong deed has been committed. But with Abraham, he manages it before, okay, but often fails to give us direction in advance of our actions. Judaism calls upon us to listen not only to the voice of conscience, but also to the norms of a heteronomous law. There is a sure way of missing the meaning of the law by either atomization or generalization, by seeing the parts without the whole, or by seeing the whole without the parts. It's impossible to understand the significance of single acts detached from the total character of life in which they are set. Some people are so occupied collecting shreds and patches of the law that they hardly think of weaving the pattern of the whole. Others are so enchanted by the glamour of generalities, by the image of ideas, right while their eyes, there's something wrong there, whatever, flare up, their actions remain below. What we must try to avoid is not only the failure to observe a single mitzvah, but the loss of the whole. The order of Jewish living is meant to be not a set of rituals, but an order of all man's existence, shaping all his traits, interests, and dispositions. This is Yirat Elokim. Should be a Purim Sameach. I know it really deserves 2 classes, but